So hello everybody and welcome to another episode of my podcast, What Makes You Click. I'm really delighted to have with me today the sort of person who these podcasts are really all about. I started these podcasts because there's so many people who are pioneers in their field that I've been fortunate enough to get to know. And when it comes to animal welfare, there is no greater pioneer than Don Broom, who's my guest today. I should also point out I have a new laptop and it seems to make pictures of me fuzzy, but Don is in crystal clear. So if you're watching on the YouTube, just look at Don, don't look at me. I'm fuzzy anyway. Don probably is known to all of you anyway. He graduated in natural sciences from Cambridge in 1964. That's before I was born. Completed his PhD on behavioural development and responses of domestic chicks, and later gained his science doctorate degree from Cambridge. He was a lecturer and then reader at Reading, and then became the world's first professor of animal welfare, which is why he is such a pioneer. His work has been cited more than 25,000 times. Those of you that work in academia, just look on in envy. We'll never get anything like that. He has literally hundreds of scientific papers, and most importantly, both his scientific papers and some of his books have been absolutely sort of landmarks in the area. And just before we started this recording, he was telling me that he was busy yesterday going through the proofs of the new edition of Domestic Animal Behaviour and Welfare, was it? Or it's Domestic Animal Behaviour and Welfare. Other books that you might know by him: Stress and Animal Welfare, Farm Animal Welfare. I don't know Andrew Fraser at all, but you do two books with him, so maybe you can tell me a little bit about him. And as I said, really there is so much that I could say about Don, but I'd rather Don said things to me. That's what these podcasts are about. So welcome, Don. Lovely to see you.
Good to see you.
And thank you for taking time out to chat to me. I think it's fair to say, you go across species. Whilst you sort of started off with chickens, I don't think there's a species that you haven't looked at as far as welfare, but in particular, it's the assessment of animal welfare, but particularly, the interactions with humans and our impact. And that's one of the things which, I mean, correctly, you've probably had this interest for a long time, but I've become much more aware more recently. You've turned your attention to the evolution of morality and religion as well. And that's something which, I mean, is that always, we'll come to it anyway, but is that something you've always been interested in, or is it a more recent development?
I think I got interested in it because I was, partly because I was teaching, because I was giving lectures on altruism, altruistic behavior, what's the underlying basis of social behavior. And what I realized was that the underlying basis of social behavior is exactly the same in humans and in other species. And therefore I started looking at all of the aspects of the social structure of humans and finding parallels in other species. And I think the longer I've been looking, the more I've seen parallels. And so actually the differences between humans and other species I now find to be extremely small, and that's contrary to the general view of the public, I think.
Yeah, okay, that's an interesting point. It's interesting because earlier in the week I was doing a podcast with Dennis Turner, and that one may come out before yours, but he was saying that one of the reasons why he ended up working was with cats, that Paul Leyhausen, who is sort of the godfather of cat behavior, just didn't mention social behavior. It just seemed to be this big void. It was the stereotypical view of cats being solitary animals. And I guess, some of my growing interest is that communication side and just how sophisticated animals seem to be, or at least capable of high levels of the communication. But I'd like to come back to that maybe later on. I guess, sort of, as I said, you were the world's first professor of animal welfare. I don't know how many there are now. I don't know if you've thought about it, but there's quite a few. So you couldn't be following in anybody's footsteps, but there must have been early influences on your people that inspired you. So, you know, for you, who were the big influences that led you into animal welfare from an academic point of view? And sort of, well, I don't know whether you realized that you could make a good academic career out of this field, that there wasn't a professor.
Right. So I really started taking a general interest in animals, birds, mammals, insects, and indeed plants. And so I was interested in biology in general, and that's going back to when I was at school. And I was very much encouraged at school to read books, which we had a list of really exciting biological books to read, and I read some of those. One of those was actually a book by Bill Thorpe, W.H. Thorpe. And another was by Nico Tinbergen, and another was by Conrad Lawrence. And so some of the things I read when I was at school encouraged me to feel that I really wanted to do some sort of biological research in order to understand more about how all of these exciting animals function. So it was to understand function was the idea at the beginning, and I was interested in the diversity of life from the outset. So I wanted to do biology at university, and I thought that medical and veterinary clinical work was a very valuable thing, but I decided I really wanted to do research, and so that's the line I would try to follow. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do that. And I had extremely stimulating people teaching me, and they were both oriented towards Cambridge as being a good place to do biological research. And so I was lucky enough to get a place and go to Cambridge. And then I decided I wanted to do biological research when I was about 16 or 17, I think. And in fact, it was animal behavior which I was most excited by as a student. And so my PhD was about animal behavior. It was about the development of behavior. And I finished up having Thorpe as my PhD supervisor and Robert Hind as my principal advisor. So two extremely able people. And just by chance, while I was a PhD student in Cambridge, Bill Thorpe was a member of the Bramble Committee. The Bramble Committee, which wrote the report, which followed on from Ruth Harrison's book, Animal Machines. And so I heard a bit about animal welfare then, although I didn't think it was anything to do with me at that point. But I was given a tape recording by Bill Thorpe of chickens in a chicken house, and he said, "Listen to the tape recording and tell me whether they're stressed." And I listened to the tape recording, and I could hear a great diversity of chicken noises. And I concluded that I couldn't tell whether or not they were stressed, all these chickens in this chicken house. I think if I'd been given it 20 years later, I'd have done a better job. But so I was exposed to the idea that we ought to think about whether animals are stressed when I was doing my PhD, although the PhD was very much a development of behavior study. So I think that was a very lucky situation to find myself in, that my PhD supervisor, who was very much an ethologist trying to understand behavior, was sitting on the Bramble Committee. So I had a very early exposure there, but it was quite a few years before I started to try to understand more about the welfare of animals.
So, I mean, you obviously you mentioned Bill Thorpe, who sort of asked the question. And I mean, were there other people that were leading in the area saying, because I mean, Ruth Harrison's book, Animal Machines, I've always thought, but I wasn't around at the time, was one of those tipping points. When that book came out, then it created that realization. And it's something that I've started to appreciate much more, is that the role that other media, as scientists, we spend hours doing things, but actually it's often a media event that can really get the public on board and bring about the political will to make the changes in some of these things. Why do you know? I guess why sort of sort of Ruth's book had such an impact? And I know obviously it's content, etc., but other people must have been concerned about animal welfare before that. And in an academic sphere, obviously the Bramble Committee identified that we need to know more about behaviour. But was it really such a vacuum beforehand?
It was a very different time. I mean, I think that what you just said, I very much agree with, that lots of people, everybody who was interacting directly with animals had some interest in the welfare of those animals. And another influence on me was that from the age of about 9, I was going every year to stay with some friends of the family on a farm in Cornwall. And so I had an idea of what it was like to be a farmer and to live on a farm, although I was very much not one. And so that, and there were people, therefore, who had a close relationship with their animals, and there still are, of course. But farming had already started the enormous change away from people interacting with individual animals towards people having large numbers of animals and starting to think of them in a different way because there were large numbers. So that change was occurring, and I became aware of that as soon as I was doing behavior research in Reading, because Reading was a very exciting place to be, really, because there were, I was in the Department of Zoology, and I soon after I went there, started a joint zoology and psychology degree. I was teaching this degree course with my colleague in psychology, Hilary Box, who worked on social behavior. And there were quite a lot of people in institutes around Reading who were working on farm animals. So people whom I bumped into asked me questions about behavior, like if little calves are kept in individual pens, does it matter? Or should they be kept in groups? And that was a question I was asked after I'd been doing research for about 2 or 3 years. And when animals are going out into a field and grazing, do they actually select anything, or are they just being lawnmowers? And the idea that you could ask these questions was something which was interesting. I'd already started doing work with development of behavior and development of the responses of animals to unexpected situations. So I'd started to make measurements which were a little bit to do with animal welfare, but it was really the collaboration with people in the National Institute for the Research in Dairying, the Institute Research in Animal Diseases, the Grassland Research Institute, which was later Institute of Grassland and Environmental Research, all of which were very close to Reading, that encouraged me to start doing research on animals in farm situations, and later animals, companion animals as well. But at that time, so when I was doing my PhD, I was working on animal behavior, and animal behavior was thought of as being an unscientific, third-rate biological subject. Animal welfare was not a subject at all, really, until the late 1980s. I mean, it was not possible to say, I am a scientist and I am working on animal welfare. And this was, so that was, if I'm going back to the 70s, that was the existing situation. So I had to say that I was working on how to improve the production of the animals, the management of the animals for people, rather than saying I was doing it for the benefit of the animals. But from a very early stage, I felt that keeping calves in little boxes for months, keeping sows in a pen which was only about 30 centimeters longer than the sow and wider than the sow, where she could just about stand up and lie down and she couldn't do anything else, and keeping chickens in battery cages with quite a number of birds all crowded very close together, I felt that those were bad things. And it was a while before I actually read Ruth Harrison's Animal Machines book, but of course that was the major message that she produced in her book in the 1960s. And the Bramble Committee, which was founded because of Ruth Harrison's work, was thought of as a very minor and unimportant thing. And her book was not widely read. Very few people knew anything about it at all, but luckily there were 1 or 2 people in government who took enough notice to set up a committee and to put on the committee people who knew something about biology and something about farm animals. But the reality was that it wasn't regarded as a scientific area. And when I was in Reading University for 19 years, and I did quite a lot of work on behavior and work on aspects of welfare which I could fit in without calling it welfare, because you weren't allowed to use the word welfare if you're talking to a scientist. And I was also looking at disease transmission. I did did studies on bovine tuberculosis and summer mastitis in cattle, both of which have a very significant behavioral component to them. So that I was doing these studies also on grazing behavior and the development of behavior in pigs and in calves. So it was possible to do these things, but you couldn't say it was animal welfare, because animal welfare wasn't something which any scientist in the world said that they were doing. And it wasn't really until David Woodgush and Piet Wiepekemer in the Netherlands and Gerrit van Putten in the Netherlands, until Marie-France Bouissou in France, there were just a few people who started to use the word welfare when they were talking about farm animals. But the average farmer, at the time that I was appointed in 1980, I started in 1986 as Professor of Animal Welfare in Cambridge. The average farmer thought that welfare was the enemy. The whole concept of welfare was a negative thing for farmers. It was something which was going to cause them trouble. The average biological research scientists in human medicine research or basic biology research thought that animal welfare was the enemy and should be suppressed. So there was a lot of criticism of the post professor of animal welfare when I got the job by people who were high up people in the scientific establishment around the world, in the UK and in other countries, because they thought that somebody who was going to work on animal welfare was going to say, you've got to stop using animals in any way at all, which wasn't something that I thought. I thought we needed to improve how we used animals, but I didn't think we needed to stop it altogether. So in the 1980s, it was a very different world from what it is now. And as you mentioned, there were probably about 20 or 30 people who were doing research which could possibly be called animal welfare. In addition, of course, to people who were doing studies of how to treat disease, which is an important aspect of improving animal welfare, but that wasn't called animal welfare research. So it was a time when animal welfare wasn't a scientific subject, and my major job in 1986, along with the other 20 or 30 people who were doing it, of whom several were in the UK, but not, was to actually try and get it established as a scientific subject. And I think we're gradually getting there. But there are probably now, instead of 20 or 30 people, there are probably 3,000 or 4,000 people doing scientific studies on animal welfare. So that's some sort of establishment, but it's still the case that it's thought of as being second-rate science by quite a high proportion of people in the academic community, I think. Yeah. So, interactions between humans and dogs or cats, is that science? A lot of scientists would say, no, it's not. I think it's an extremely important thing to do, but a lot of people would say it's not really science. So there's been a really dramatic change, and I hope the change is going to continue along the line of thinking about what humans are doing in a more responsible way. And it's also, of course, related to what we are doing to the general environment in the world and to wild animals and not just domestic animals. So there have been really very substantial changes in over this period of 30 or 40 years when I've been, 40, more than 40 years now.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and we'll come to the sort of one biology, because you've written a few papers in recent years, particularly, which actually sounds like it's always been there with you, but it's sort of now the opportunity to do it. But it's, for me personally, that's fascinating. I've never heard this story before, And I went to vet school in the 1980s. And,
Yes,
Bristol, I was fortunate that I had John Webster and Christine Nichol arrived as
you
this
were.
fresh-faced
Yes.
person. And Christine's going to be doing one of these podcasts later next month. And just reflecting on it, I can remember some of our early lectures in animal husbandry, and they called them animal husbandry, animal behavior, and the welfare stuff wasn't until about the third year the word welfare was probably really used. And by that time you had got the chair. I guess I should have done some research on this, but in the light of what you just said, who was Colleen Mcleod? Because the chair was funded by I presume, somebody gave a lot of money to Cambridge to set up a chair. And she must have had a good reason behind it. And I guess, was she alive or dead? I don't even know whether it was a legacy after. That's a terrible admission, but hey, now's my opportunity to clear up these things.
So Colleen Mcleod was a lady who thought that it would be good if there was scientific research on animal welfare. I never met her. She died, and it was a legacy, and the legacy was to the British Veterinary Association, and her veterinary surgeon was the treasurer of the British Veterinary Association at that time, and so some money was given to the British Veterinary Association, and the British Veterinary Association then toted it around the vet schools. Bristol already had John Webster, and so and Edinburgh already had people not in the vet school, but in they had Barry Hughes, who's a vet, but the people were in the Poultry Research Institute, as it was then, and Lawson Salisbury, who was the head of the vet school in Cambridge, managed to persuade the BVA that Cambridge was a good place to have it. I had nothing to do with all that. This happened in 1985. And so in 1985, they advertised a job as Professor of Animal Welfare. And I remember going to an Association for the Study of Animal Behavior meeting early in 1985. And I met Peter Jewell, who was Professor of Reproductive Physiology in Cambridge, and someone very interested in the behavior of animals in feral conditions in particular. And he said to me, "Do you know about this job?" And I at that moment had just seen it in advertised, but I didn't otherwise know about it. And he said, "You ought to apply for that." And that was a very kind thing for him to do. He was directly nothing to do with it. He wasn't on the committee, so he was allowed to do things like talk to somebody who he met at a behaviour conference. And I felt extremely fortunate at the age of 43, as I was then, to get a job as a professor in Cambridge.
Yeah.
And so it gave me an opportunity, and I'd written some papers, but I did write a lot more after I got there, and it was an opportunity for me personally.
Yeah.
And it also, there were people doing the similar things in other places. And I'd mentioned John, you referred to John Webster. Christine Nichol hadn't got to Bristol by that moment, but she soon did 3 years later, 2 or 3 years later. Marion Dawkins was running a group in Oxford, and I knew all these people well, and I also knew the other people and I knew them well because of, firstly, Association for the Study of Animal Behavior, ASAB, and secondly, what is now ISAE, which was then the Society for Veterinary Ethology, became International Society for Applied Ethology. So I was going to these meetings and giving papers at the meetings when I had something useful to say. And so we all knew one another, the sort of 30 people in the world who were doing this kind of work. And Andrew Fraser, incidentally, was the secretary and president at one time of Society for Veterinary Ethology. He was in Edinburgh, and then he went to St. John's, Newfoundland, the vet school in Newfoundland, and Memorial University of Newfoundland. And he was the editor of Applied Animal, the first editor of Applied Animal Ethology, which was just starting, and which was initially entirely working on how to use behavior to improve animal production, and then started to put in animal welfare papers as well, partly at Andrew Fraser's instigation. I should say that Andrew Fraser is still alive. He's, I think, 95 now. Wow. And not in good health, but still living in Newfoundland. And I, of course, collaborated with him on a book, and we collaborated on it for a number of editions. And I've just written the last. In fact, I've written the last two editions, 3 editions. But this one's just me, and he's now not directly involved in it, but a lot of his useful practical knowledge went into the earliest editions of the book. So ISAE was doing good things, but it was a small group of people, and by this time animal behavior had become quite respectable. So I mean, the first people in animal behavior, and Tinbergen got the Nobel Prize. Tinbergen, Lawrence, and von Frisch got the Nobel Prize, and that sort of changed it a bit and made it a more respectable thing. But animal welfare was not, as I said, thought of as a scientific subject. So it was a big battle on the part of all of us who were involved in it to actually say studying animal welfare is a scientific discipline, and we need to be looking at all of the mechanisms for dealing with disease, for dealing with unfavorable environments that the animals find themselves in, including humans. I mean, human welfare is an important topic, but I have to say that in the 1980s, I would say that it wasn't thought of as an important topic. Psychiatry was thought of as a third-rate end of the weakest part of human medicine.
I think it still is.
Things that were going on in the brain, which actually controls everything, were not thought of as central to medicine or veterinary medicine. And this was starting to change, but it's taken a long while to change. And I think actually in practical terms that quite a lot of human development in terms of assessing human welfare has come because of the studies of other species, because of course the methods are very similar. The things that you can do are very similar. The physiological measurements, the measurements of pathology, the abnormalities of behavior, there are extremely close parallels between humans and other species in terms of how you evaluate the welfare of individuals. And that was one of the areas which I thought was an important thing to do. And I actually coordinated a Darlem conference 20 odd years ago, whose aim was to say, let's look at the welfare of humans and other animals. And we had a mixture of people from the medical, veterinary, animal science worlds. And so there was, people were starting to try to draw these things together. And I think they've got drawn together a bit more now, which is the sort of one biology theme, one health, one welfare, one biology. The terms mean the same, whatever species, human or not.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because, as I said, it's again, it's that sort of, there's a complete void there, and as you say, I mean, I still get, people say to me sort of, well, you're not a proper scientist, because I'm working on companion animals. Yes. Dogs and cats and horses, they're not real animals for biologists. And thinking, well, yes, they are, and you can ask questions of them that you just can't ask in some of the other species as well. And the uniqueness of the relationship between people and their dogs and how long we've been associated with it. But I mean, it sounds almost as if the chair was a poisoned chalice. I don't want to take anything away from you, but that sounds almost as if sort of people thinking, well, maybe I'm just being too cynical, but well, we'll create a chair, and it won't ever achieve anything, but we'll have given a nod to animal welfare. I mean, am I being too cynical, or do you think there was an element of that?
Yeah, well, I think there's an element of it. I mean, of course, there were people who could see that detailed studies of the really complex range of coping systems that individuals have to try to deal with the problems that they encounter during life, and what happens when it all works and there is pleasure, and what happens when it all goes badly and there is pain and fear and stress. Those sorts of things were being thought about, but it certainly wasn't called, I mean, didn't have the word welfare in it until really the 1980s. And there was no research funding of any kind given to anybody in any country for animal welfare research until about 1982 or 3. Wow. There were 1 or 2 studies done by people who were able to do them, calling them something else. But if they called it welfare, they wouldn't have got the money. But it was happening in other countries as well. So it was happening in Sweden. Ingvar Eckersbo set up a group which produced people like Bo Algers and Per Jensen and a number of others. And Piet Wipkemer, who was he moved to Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and he went again from animal behavior into welfare research. And quite a strong team of people in France with Robert Dancer and Pierre Mormed and the group of INRA. They were mostly in government research institutes, INRA, there. And then there were some people in Canada. There was David Fraser, who had spent some time in Edinburgh, was working for Agriculture Canada, which was a conservation organization, Environment Canada and Agriculture Canada. He was involved with both. So he was starting to do things. Ian Duncan, who had worked in Edinburgh, went to Guelph, and that was a very significant position. And later, Georgia Mason, who worked in Cambridge, was a PhD student when in the first years that I was in Cambridge, which she has also got. So there are a number of other people, and people like Jack Albright and Ted Friend, who were working on the behavior of farm animals in Purdue University and in Texas A&M University in the USA, and later Joy Mensch, who worked in Davis, Ray Strickley in the University of Maryland. So there were people. I can't name everybody. There are too many, but there were 3.
You're doing a good job, I think.
There were 2 or 3 people in Japan. There were 1 or 2 in Spain and Italy and Norway, and 4 different places in Germany had animal welfare research groups. And that's by about 1995. So things had moved significantly, and but there were a few people like David Woodgush in Edinburgh who had a significant influence in trying to promote it as being a scientific subject. So the things did develop quite. They really did get going, and it was something which was driven by the public, because the public, a lot of people in the public thought that it was wrong to cause suffering to a dog, a cat, a cow, a pig, a chicken. They thought that those things were wrong. And they also thought that it was wrong to kill wild animals if it was going to cause them pain. That if you're going to kill them, they shouldn't be caused a lot of pain. And so there were these attitudes 30 odd years ago, which you will remember this because you were sort of developing in the same, in as a student, at least in the same period. And so there was this public attitude that animal welfare was an important matter. And there were politicians who were doing something about it. And I remember very soon after I was appointed in Cambridge, I had a letter, because people sent letters then, from Stanley Johnson. That's Boris Johnson's father. And Stanley Johnson was working for the European Commission, and there was a concern about leg hold traps for catching wild animals. And he asked me if there was any scientific evidence about the impact of leg hold traps on the animals they were catching. There wasn't very much, but there were some things which were pretty obvious, which you could say based on the knowledge which we did have about the effects of different degrees of injury on the welfare of an animal, and the effect of being sort of stuck in a trap for weeks while you gradually froze to death or starved to death. So there was some evidence. And he was one of the people who tried to do something about it. And he also tried to do something about the issue of seals, which has continued over the years to be important. It was particularly the European Union which was driving some of these political issues and trying to do something about things. And the UK had a substantial impact in terms of the number of people who are starting to do research in different places on the welfare of animals. And that was initially, probably initially it was about laboratory animals, because the biggest public concern was in that area. But it really, the biggest concern should have been about farm animals, because most of the problems are farm animal problems, and there are a lot more farm animals. But of course, there's also a lot of concern about companion animals. And so dogs and cats and horses, you know, our first UK legislation, which was absolutely pioneering in the world, was to do with horses and dogs. It wasn't acceptable to kill your dog by beating it to death, or kill your horse by beating it to death.
Yeah.
And people said we ought to have a law saying that. So it started with companion animals, and then it became a lot about what laboratory animals suffered, and then eventually it started to look at farm animals, and now it's starting to look a bit more about working animals and wild animals.
That's fascinating, because I'd never thought about that early legislation, because I mean, one of the things that struck me as a student was we had one afternoon on sort of cat and dog husbandry, because it seemed to be assumed that their owners love them, so their welfare must be good. And that's what really drove me into the field, was sort of, well, that's not what I see. Yes. But equally, just listening to that, it reminds me that as a student, you know, there was a lot of militancy in animal rights, and I will call it animal rights, not animal welfare, because I think that's what it was. And one of the lecturers at Bristol actually had a bomb put under his car, and the story is that it went off, but fortunately he'd woken up late and was driving fast, and so it fell off as it went off. Otherwise he would have had serious injuries to his legs. And I just wonder, you know, it sounds almost, if there was that element of the growth of animal welfare, people started to think about it, that militancy, and that's what drove the government started to think about, well, yeah, we do need to be investing in this, because I would say as a student, probably, yeah, the number one terrorism, as it would be called now, were the ALF, basically.
Yes.
So, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not condoning terrorism, but it may have been a driving force for, at least, you know, there may be some sort of for people to take it seriously, and that allowed the investment in it more widely.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you raise that, because I think that at that time, so going back 35 years, the people who wanted to do something about animal rights, who wanted to stop suffering in animals, so they were concerned about welfare, they wouldn't talk to the people who were doing experiments or farming, or that. So there was hardly any discussion. And one of the first things that I tried hard to do was to talk to all of the people involved, and to encourage people to talk to one another. And that was something which took longer to happen here in the UK than it did in the EU as a whole, because they had already got some committees which they could adapt in the EU, and the committees included scientists who were not representing anybody. And so that was an important thing, to have these scientific committees where the people concerned were not representatives, whereas there were the UK committees tended to have people who came from both sides, but that didn't always work, because they didn't talk to one another very well. So I think that that's been a very substantial and good change, that now people are talking to one another a lot better than they used to about the issues, and also they can now talk with facts. So we now have evidence about the welfare of animals. We have evidence about the nature of the interactions between people and their pets, between people and the farm animals that they work with, and about what is the effect of different systems and different procedures on the welfare. We've got now we've got thousands of scientific papers which information can be used. And so the scientific information has come in between and has resulted in people talking to one another, and people from the animal users and the animal protectors using the same information. And that's actually been very important in the whole development of our interactions, human interactions with other species. And there are still lots of people who don't know a lot about it, but who have the idea, well, that information might be there. And the sort of things that you're doing and that many of our colleagues in the domestic animal management area are doing, that kind of information is now being used, but it didn't exist 40 years ago. So
yeah, it's fascinating because I've never thought about things in that way. That's why I love chatting to you, because you've got that, always thoughtful and thought-provoking. I'm going to ask you something, and I can always delete it if you don't want. I mean, I've been very fortunate where I've ended up as a vet actually in a non-veterinary environment, because, as my colleagues sometimes tease me, I'm surrounded by real scientists. And but as a vet, I know a little about a lot of subjects, and I can perhaps bring together synergies. And I've been incredibly lucky like that. I don't know how to phrase this. Being a non-vet in a vet school, vets can be snobbish. I mean, I'll be honest, I can say this as the vet. Vets can be a bit snobbish and a bit self-important at times. I mean, do you feel that there were things that perhaps you couldn't achieve that you would have wanted to achieve if you'd been a vet? I mean, that's about as light as I can be and as diplomatic. I'm not diplomatic, so
yes, of course.
But I'm just fascinated.
But first of all, I had, as I mentioned, I'd actually had 3 different research projects on disease transmission before I moved from a biological department to a veterinary department. So it wasn't completely a completely different world, as it were. And I was already meeting people who were doing animal welfare research who were vets, and there were sort of 3 or 4 people, but there were some. What I decided to do when I started in Cambridge Veterinary School was to try to catch up with the sorts of things that I ought to know. And so I went to all the research talks in the vet school, and I did all the teaching that I could do, even if it involved doing some things which I didn't know before I got the job in Cambridge. So I learned quite a lot. That was the first thing. I learned the language a bit. I learned how to talk to vets a bit, and of course I've never said that I'm a vet, and I'm very careful not to say that, because I couldn't do the clinical work which people who are trained as vets could do. But I think it became clear from all the research groups which were forming that the best way to do it was to have people from different backgrounds in a research group. So you needed people who were biologists, psychologists, neuroscientists, vets working on diseases, and sometimes human doctors working on diseases, in order to be able to deal with all of the aspects of the subject, because it's a very wide-ranging subject. I mean, if you talk about the mechanisms that humans have, or pigs have, or trout have for dealing with the problems that they encounter during life, there's a lot of different biological systems, and you need to have people who understand something about each, but they won't all be able to do everything. So I was coming with a certain package of knowledge, and I added some things. I've learned a lot of things that I didn't know. I'd never believed that I would have been writing papers on things that I do write about now. And so I had to learn a lot of things, but mainly I did it by trying hard to collaborate with and seek advice from people who knew the things that I didn't know. And I think that's what you need in a very wide-ranging subject like the one that we're in. I think there's a big disadvantage of being in a wide-ranging subject, because you can't ever be on top of everything,
Mm.
and so it's much more difficult than just being a cell physiologist looking at neurons. Even though neurons are fairly complicated, the whole organism is a lot more complicated. And the kind of research that you do and that I have been doing is actually more complicated research than that which a lot of other people do. And so people should respect you for what you do, because it's difficult.
It's nice to hear you say that. I have a friend who was a theoretical physicist, and he,
Yeah.
and he said, well, yeah, people talk about how complicated my work is. He said, but at least I've got standard units to work with.
Yes.
He said, you do anything and you've got to argue that's the right unit to use for this situation. And this is something I try to get across to our students, is that, yeah, behavior it's easy to do badly. It's hard, and I've done plenty of, well, it's still scientific. It nudges things forward, but not in the way that you might think. But it's hard to, I mean, that's one of the things I love about it. You need that philosophical element, because you do need to justify. I'm actually in the process of writing a paper at the moment about, clinical decision making in a field where we lack information, good quality science, because, evidence-based medicine is all well and good, but it comes with it intrinsic biases about, it's going to favor monotherapies that you can put into an RCT. Well, most of the stuff I do with behavior, we know the drugs help in combination with all sorts of other things. So, there's immediately a bias against those sorts of things. And that then has impact on the way that we think about it. You say it is hard. But did you, I'm just intrigued, and perhaps I'm being a bit mischievous here, but I mean, did you have them? I'm not asking you to name names or anything like that, but there must have been doors that were closed to you, I would have thought, at that time, because even now, it seems, I would say that, a lot of people think that, oh, if it's animal welfare, it's the vet who knows about it. And that, vets do a bit in health as far as welfare goes, but they don't do much training. And there's plenty of courses that produce graduates who know far more about animal welfare than your average vet, I would say, nowadays. Yeah. But, at the time that you moved to Cambridge, there must have been, sort of, who is this guy who, he's not a vet, he can't know about welfare, surely, Yes. There must have been
there certainly was that attitude, and there was the idea that you could, that only vets would know about the welfare of other species, and only human doctors would know about the welfare of humans, and somebody who wasn't either of those wouldn't be able to say anything useful to them. So yes, there was that attitude, and so that's a prejudice, I suppose. But I got used to that in many ways. But I have to say that the scientific world thinks of veterinary medicine as being a less sophisticated subject than whatever it is that the person who is doing the judging does. So when somebody does some other aspects of biology or physics or chemistry, they think veterinary medicine is not that clever in comparison, but actually it is clever, and and that certainly is my view. But there are lots of people who are qualified as a vet who couldn't do much of the research that you or I do. And so, yeah, it's a difficult area, and as I say, it's also the case that the people who are the sort of frontline cell biologists who use animals in their research still don't like those who are studying animal welfare because they think it might cause problems for them. I think there aren't quite as many people who have that view now, and I think there's a wider view in the veterinary profession that there are people who know something useful even if they aren't qualified as vets. So it's sort of moved a bit, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I'm just sort of, as I said, when you're a pioneer, there, that you're going into a field, there's nobody to lead you there, but equally there can be a lot of barriers as well. But yeah, now I'll answer this question after you answer it. Okay, thank you for that. what do you think? Because I started off by giving some flavour of what you've achieved, and as I said, and I think a lot of people will be surprised to think that there was no chair in animal welfare before 1986. Was it 1986? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but what do you see as your greatest achievement? I'll tell you what I think it is in a minute, but I'm just intrigued.
I think actually switching things around to the point where animal welfare animal welfare science is being accepted more as an area of scientific study which is worth something. I think that's probably been an important thing to do. But I would say that actually the most important thing I've done has certainly been to teach students who are going out and passing on the word. So I think teaching has probably been the most important thing. It's been more important to do the teaching than to do the research. I think perhaps the most important single thing I've been involved with doing was collaborating with Audrey Ayton in the production of little videos, a sequence of things which were called stimulus response, which had been shown to an enormous proportion of school children because they put animal behavior into the curriculum. And what Audrey Ayton suggested was we ought to talk about animal welfare as being part of the bit that they're going to learn. And so we made these videos, and Christine Nicol was also involved in doing this in Bristol. And so they used information from our work in Cambridge and work in Bristol and one or two other people. And those videos were then shown to millions of school children over the years. They were done at two different ages. One was about 9 and the other was about 13. And I think that probably had more influence than all the research that I've done in my whole career. So teaching young children. But I would say probably the most valuable thing that I've done has been to spend 20 odd years sitting on EU committees and getting the animal welfare science put into reports, which then got translated into legislation. So I would say that's probably, in the research side of things, it's probably more important to actually put it all together in these EFSA reports, which then resulted in new legislation across the whole of Europe, and which has then been followed by many other countries in the world. So that's probably been the most important thing. And that, incidentally, is something which I was strongly discouraged from doing at one stage by people who were evaluating my progress in Cambridge, because they said, well, we don't get anything from the research assessment exercise over that. You're just spending your time on a committee when you could be doing more research, and that has a negative effect on your output. Whereas my view is that it's had a positive effect on my output, a positive effect on what so I think that's been an achievement to have done that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to hear you say that. I've got the VHS tapes of stimulus response actually in another room still. I used to use them with our undergraduate students, thinking you were saying they were for 8 and 9-year-olds. I'm thinking, oh well.
Well, there were two levels, but they had some good information in.
It was really good because it taught the stimulus response, etc. And they were with pigs, and people, biology can be with domestic animals. That was, I think, one of the neat things. But there was a couple of points. Well, I promised I would answer the question. My initial thought was and people who listen to these podcasts will know that this name comes up again and again because it was it was an early influence, Sir Robert Hind. And when he gave a lecture in Bristol, and I wrote to him, and he wrote a beautiful letter, but I had no idea who he was. But 20 years later, when I got the chair in clinical animal behavior here, or veterinary behavior here, I wrote to him and said, you won't know who I am, but 20 years ago, I wrote to you because you gave an inspirational lecture. You took the time to give me a reply, and I just want to let you know, this is the first chair in the discipline. And he said to me, and he said, one of the joys of lecturing is you never know who you're inspiring or what you're inspiring them to do. And that's what I was going to say with you, that, everybody in welfare, I think, that I know owes a debt to you. and that is an enormous influence, and everything trickles down from that. And I can't think of another person I can say that about, but it's nice that you see the value of the teaching, because there are, as you know, there are a lot of professors who just like to profess and do their research and not actually profess to the people, the next generation, or the people who are going to make the difference further down. So now there was something else I was going to pick up on. You were talking about the committees. No, I've forgotten now. No, it's typical. My mind goes, but so oh, no, it's gone. Anyway, as I said, it shows you that these things aren't scripted. So let's go back to a sort of almost at the beginning. We were talking about this sort of the one biology, and I've heard you talk about this quite a bit, or write about it, and also heard you talk about it recently, increasingly. And well, the commonality, and as you say, a lot of the welfare issues arise in relation to interactions as well. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking about that you sort of, well, there's all these things, and yeah, understanding the interaction side, and interactions is a very difficult area to work in. But one of the things I sort of, wanted to ask you about is sentience. And I've been reading some of your more recent writings on it, and to me, and one, as I said, there's clearly this theme of the commonality of biology, which, yeah, absolutely. However, and that humans aren't that different as well. But the more, and this might sound a bit ironic, but the more work I do on cognition in dogs, the less I think that they are cognitively sophisticated. I think dogs are incredibly perceptive. And the more that, and then take the example of dogs, because that's the area that probably my more fundamental work, that's what I was going to talk about, was RAEs you mentioned here, and the problem with that, but that's probably of less interest to other people. But yeah, the more I sort of study dogs, I work, it seems that dogs are very perceptive, and they've worked, if I do this, I get an easy life. And, and you can see that that's, and to me, where an area, and a couple of years ago, I had a sort of short sabbatical in Japan at the Primate Research Institute there. And seeing, the chimps do this memory task where things are flashed on a screen for a split second and they just do the sequence. And to me, when I look at that, I think, well, how on earth do they do it? And is it because our minds are so cluttered with this reflective cognition, that we reflect on what we do? We're always offering explanations post hoc for why we do something, which increasingly I think are, fairy tales that we generate because of that reflective element. And to me, I wonder, that's the thing that I'm sort of intrigued by, is how much do you think from a, yes, you can feel pain and go, ouch, but you can then reflect on it afterwards. And how common do you think that is in biology? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, I mean, I think it's interesting what you say about, firstly, about the dogs. And dogs are, what we all do, and when I say we, I mean all of us sentient beings, including dogs, is we develop strategies which get us to where we want to be. And so first of all, we have a concept of where we want to be, and the dog has the concept of where it wants to be. And you mentioned it, have an easy life. I'm quite sure you're right that the dog works out what is a good thing to do to have an easy life, and that's what humans generally do as well. So it's not that unusual, in that other species do it as well. But they have various abilities which they use in order to finish up by having the easy life, and they are extremely good at predicting what humans are going to do based on what they've evaluated from the past that happens in a number of different circumstances. And so they make it easy for the human to do what they've done before again, and they give them the clues which maximize the chance that the dog will get what it wants to get without having too much trouble. And so I think that's what they are doing. They are aiming for an easy life. But of course, sometimes in order to do that, they have to use really quite sophisticated abilities. So I don't think it's a straightforward thing to do that, whether you're a human or whether you're a dog. And I think the same applies to other species, that they try to manage their lives so that they have minimal problems. And this is what we need to do. Okay, so that's what everybody is doing. All the individuals of different species, that's the sort of thing they're trying to do. If you live in a social world, it's more difficult to do it than if you live in a more individual world. So that's why social life generally means more complex cognitive functioning, and it's the socially living birds, mammals, fish, and so on that tend to have the highest levels of cognitive functioning. But there are still lots of different things going on. There are still lots of different processes. So in order to try to get to the easy life, you still have to go through quite a lot of difficulties. Now, what you then said was, we spend a lot of time reflecting on things, and to what extent do other kinds of animals spend time reflecting on things? And it's quite difficult to demonstrate that, as you know very well. To demonstrate that an individual of another species is reflecting on something is quite a difficult thing to do. But we are getting more and more sophisticated cognitive tests, cognitive studies on a wide variety of species, which are showing us that other kinds of animals, not just humans, can do things. And as I've said to you, and you've heard me say it, it's actually extremely difficult to find something which humans can do, which no other animals can do. They can do it to some degree. They can do it, but we have to devise very difficult tests in order that we can find out exactly what they can do. So I think there is a lot of reflecting on things in the sense of, okay, in order to manage my life and program it so that I don't have really big problems, I have to think about what might happen in the future if this happened or that happened or that happened. What do I do if that individual behaves in that way or that way or that way? What's the least difficult path for me to follow? And so there's an enormous amount of predicting of the future going on, whereas it always used to be said that humans can predict the future and other species can't. It's patently nonsense. A high proportion of what all the animals that we keep as domestic animals, or all the vertebrates, have the ability to predict aspects of the future, and they are doing it all the time in order to manage their lives. So I think that some of the things which are going on in order to find the path to an easy life are still very difficult, complicated, impressive things to do. Demonstrating it we are getting a bit better each year at demonstrating what individuals of other species are, what's going on in their brains, what other decisions they're taking, what's the information they're processing. We're getting better at doing that. But you very often have to use very contrived situations. Like, I mean, one of the things we tried to do was to teach animals to use a mirror. And we were able to demonstrate that pigs could use information from a mirror. And that was actually quite difficult for me and the two people I worked with. It was quite difficult for us to work it out, how to test it in a way which couldn't be wrong, and which would actually tell us what we want. And other people have done much more complicated and difficult things than that, because information from a mirror is not the most difficult thing to do in life. There are other things which are much more difficult to do. A lot of the social responses are much more complicated than evaluating what's in a mirror. So we are starting to get more sophisticated tests going on now, and they are demonstrating that quite a lot of animals of different kinds can do things. I mean, we know now that there are fish which can learn things which the average chimpanzee can't learn. or it doesn't learn, it has a lot of difficulty learning it. And so there are things coming up which are surprising. And nowadays, when you say what are the most sophisticated brains, probably humans are, but then you probably are going to go to parrots and crows as being better than primates in a lot of ways. And everybody used to say bird brain, as if bird brain was
as an insult.
Inferior. And now bird brain means slightly better than some primates.
Yeah.
And of course, not all birds have the same abilities, but certainly some of the birds are doing things which used to be thought of as solely human abilities.
So one of the areas I've started to get interested in, and I'm only just sort of starting to scratch the surface, is what's referred to as 4E cognition. Embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. And you mentioned the crows, and and I'm just intrigued with that, because we think for people who don't know, there's a group of crows, New Caledonian crows, who sort of down in the southern hemisphere. It's not just an excuse for scientists to go to a nice place to study them. Nicky Clayton, obviously at Cambridge, working with them, but they seem to have particular skills in using tools, using sticks as tools. And the stuff that I was reading was saying, well, one way of interpreting it, and the danger is that the study of cognition, and I think you've flagged it up there is a danger that it becomes very anthropocentric, that we think of cognitive abilities in terms of human cognitive abilities, and do the animals have these abilities? Well, human cognitive abilities are human. So
they have abilities that we don't have.
Yeah, exactly. The ways of representing things that we can't begin to imagine. It's like sort of, if we say well, I'm colorblind, there's certain colors you cannot explain to me what they are because I can't see them. But what they were saying with the idea with the New Caledonian crows is, do they have a cognitive ability, or is it that their anatomy is such that the position of their eyes and their beak, I don't know if you've heard this argument, but their eyes and their beak are such that when they pick up a stick, they can see the stick in effect as an extension of the beak. So there's no great cognitive ability. They're just using, in effect, an extended version of the beak that happens to be in their mouth at the time. And, and I find that quite fascinating. I don't know if you've heard that explanation, and that actually,
yes, I've heard it. I've heard people say it. Yes, I mean, we can say that we do some ththings like that. We have things which we hold in our hands, and they do things which our hands could have done some of it.
But it's just a sort of the rush to make a cognitive explanation, because people, animal cognition has become, it's obviously it's very important to animal welfare. If we didn't believe animals were sentient, then to me welfare is fairly meaningless as a term, if we don't think they can suffer. But and how much of this rush to represent things as cognition, and I guess to go back to my earlier point, that a lot of things that we may think about as cognitive abilities, how much of it, as I said, is that post hoc explanation of us thinking, oh, that's the reason why I do it, I have that concept, when actually the brain probably may use a completely different way of solving the problem. And if we look for these fictitious cognitive abilities in other animals, you can see analogies that would fit with it, but then you're making the fundamental problem of looking for the evidence to support your belief, not distinguishing the explanations. And that as I said, it sounds very negative, but that to me is the concern, that there's this explosion. And I had a fascinating chat with one of my colleagues who is a primatologist, and if they see this in, and he was explaining the experiment they were going to do, and he said, well, if they do this, and I said, if that was a dog, there's no way I could get that published as a cognitive ability. People will say, there's much simpler rules to explain it. But because he works in primates, people will say, that would demonstrate that. I was thinking, whoa, how much do you think we are rushing? This balance between rushing towards, because of our interest and our commonality, and rushing towards cognitive explanations, and I don't think it alters the nature of suffering. It doesn't alter the fact that animals suffer, you know. To me, and that, you know, and that, do you think, or how much of an issue do you think it is that we are perhaps overemphasizing or over-suggesting cognitive abilities that are not focusing on, overcomplicating things?
Well, I certainly agree with what you said, that in many cases, a task is being solved, and we think of what might be the process which has been used to solve it, and we might be wrong. There might be a different route to solving that task, and in some cases it might be a simpler one. In other cases it's going to be a more complicated one, and of course we have the awful situation still where there is the idea that if there's a simple explanation and a more complicated one, you must go for the simpler one, when actually it may be wrong. It may be the complicated explanation which is the correct one. I think a lot of processing which we do is more complicated than if you just describe it in the simplest possible terms, and the same applies to other species. But we don't actually know which route is being used to get there, and that's actually a very difficult thing to find out. We're not good enough on the brain function yet to be able to do that, and we may never be it. So it's an extremely difficult thing to do. The fact that a task is solved doesn't necessarily mean that the way it was done is the same way that you or I would have done it. Absolutely right. But you can still say that it is a relatively complicated task. I think you can still say that there are things being achieved now. There's certainly things being achieved in cognition studies which were thought of as being impossible for anything but humans. And there are more and more every year of these. And so I think that in itself is an impressive thing. But I really agree with what you said, that the world that we live in, we shouldn't assume that it's the world that other animals live in, and we are extremely primitive in some ways. I mean, our appreciation of the olfactory world is certainly much less complex than that of almost all mammals and quite a few reptiles, fish, and birds. We have quite good olfactory discrimination in some ways, but we're nowhere near the real experts. And what is an olfactory world like? I mean, we tend to have a very visually dominated world, and we use auditory signals which are quite sophisticated. Other species use other kinds of signals. So even just on that, their world might include things which we just haven't thought of yet. So finding out those things is a fascinating thing to investigate.
Yeah, I mean, I think, absolutely. That's why I love being in academia. With lots of students who are interested in trying to address some of these things, and going, well, after that little interruption,
I think I had finished saying something just about.
Yeah, we were talking about the abilities, and the fascinating thing is it's still. The interesting thing is that they have the ability to achieve the goal. Exactly how they achieve it is a different issue, and we're still a long way from knowing those things. And I just wanted to share with you a little anecdote, and it's one of those things, and I just say it partly because hopefully it will trigger me to do something about it. A number of years ago, I had a student, and we looked at teaching cats a discrimination task. Put it into a tea maze, and they had to learn where the food treat was. And basically it was like a tea maze with two cat flaps, and on the cat flap there was a colored dot, and which had a certain odor. So it was all counterbalanced, but for the sake of argument, let's say that there was a red dot that smelt of strawberries, or a yellow dot that smelt of bananas. And we taught them that they had to learn where the treat was, whether it was the yellow or the red dot. But let's say for this particular cat, it was for the red dot that smelt of strawberries. Once they'd learned that behavior, what we did is we then crossed over the cues. So now you had a red dot that smelt of bananas and a yellow dot that smelt of strawberries. And what really surprised me was that 9 out of the 10 cats followed the visual cue. Now, this is one of those things, as scientists, we often look at population level stuff, but so 90% of the cats did the visual cue, had learned the visual rather than the olfactory cue, which I thought was interesting because we think how good a cat's sense of smell is, and you think, well, but then I sort of sat back and I said, actually, the other interesting thing is 10% of the cats don't. 10% of the cats have learned the olfactory cue. What's the world they live in like compared to the others? And about 10% of cats urine spray. Well, if we think of urine spray as, and I know it's a small sample size, but you know the experiment that I want to do. I want to get a load of urine spraying cats and test them on this task. See if they have, whether I still get my 90% or whether it flips 90% the other way, because I would love it if it goes the other way. So that's, I mean, but it does make you think, that, we put a big emphasis on visual information, but I just wonder, certainly in that particular task, 10% of the cats have chosen to make the olfactory association in identical situations. So they probably live in a very different world.
But well, there's another explanation to what you.
Are you going to ruin it? Go on.
Because I have little doubt that the cats and the dogs with which we interact know extremely well that we are largely odor blind, and we don't take any notice of all this chunk of the world which they presumably do appreciate more than we do. So they know this. I mean, this is a pretty simple thing for them to learn. Humans, you have to show them something either in this way or that way, because they can't understand those other ways over there, which we can do, but they can't. And I think that they would learn that very early on in their interactions with humans. As soon as they're observing humans in some detail, they would know what humans can and can't do. And we know that, I mean, I quite often take a dog for a walk. It's my son's dog, and there's no doubt that the dog knows where I can go and where I can't go. And it also knows what it can do without inconveniencing me. And so the difference between your 90% and 10% might be that the 90% are the ones who are very good at working out what humans can do, and the 10% are the ones which haven't worked it out. It might be they are all in the same world, but they differ in this little cognitive way.
I think
it's another possibility.
No, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things, certainly with dogs, I think dogs very quickly cotton on that using your visual sense is far more useful for predicting humans than the olfactory, because, you change your deodorant, it means nothing. But the dog can clearly detect, change your shower gel, well, just you smell different each day, and then we change our pelage the whole time because we change our clothes each day, all these things, and they have to learn what to ignore. And if you want to be able to predict your human, which is what gets you the easy food, then better to use vision. And in fact, just today I was one of my former graduate students writing up, and there's some work done by another of my graduate students that we never got around to publishing, where we looked at foxhounds compared to pet dogs and their visual responses to facials. And the foxhounds have very, very limited exposure to people who, kept in a hunt. And they didn't respond in the same way as your pet dog. So, there's that great mix between genetics and environment. And I think it happens very early on in dogs.
They don't respond to human gaze direction as well as a dog which is living all the time with a human. And that's also, this was one of the things which was found comparing wolves and tame wolves that we keep, that the wolves are not paying as much attention to the human gaze. But that's not very surprising, really, because usually been living in a rather different
Yeah.
situation.
But I think it's interesting because, yeah, you've got that wolf-dog distinction, which you would, even if though the wolves have been heavily socialized, they don't seem to latch in the same way. And then you've got the foxhounds, which are dogs, but they've just not had that early experience, and therefore they tend not to develop. And I think that's it, isn't it? It's sort of that early environment in shaping what you should attend to and what you shouldn't attend to. So another experiment that we did a number of years ago was on biological motion with dogs, and the aggressive dog with biological motion, which is what, for people who are listening who might not know what it is, it's when you have these dots on a screen and you can say, look, that looks like a person walking in a certain direction. What we found is that the dogs responded to biological motion, but the dogs that were sort of didn't have any aggressive tendencies, they would respond particularly to the biological motion that looked like a person walking towards you, and tend to largely ignore the biological motion of something walking across the screen. Whereas dogs that were had anxiety and issues of aggressive behavior, they were just as attentive to both of them. And you just think, maybe they're living in a world with so much more load because they're attending to so much. There's so much that our brains take in that we don't bother about it, and I just wondered about that as a, and the role that might play, that actually, with anxiety, you find it difficult to filter out stuff as being irrelevant. The importance of filtering out what is irrelevant. But anyway, one final question I'd like to ask you. Thank you so much for spending so much time with me today. Just from your point of view, I mean, you've mentioned about some of the people that inspired you. Who do you see as the rising stars in the field? People to watch out for, or who are going to continue the momentum that you've built? Not the established people. I mean,
Yes. Well, it depends what you call established. I mean, I think that there are some particular areas of investigation which are likely to do very well in the future. And my feeling is that, and I had this feeling for a long time, that is, we're mainly, if we're talking about animal welfare and coping with the world that we live in, then a very high proportion of that is to do with brain function. And so we need to know more about brain function. And so the people who are doing the studies where they are getting more direct information from brain function are likely to be amongst those who are going to achieve the most in the future. So that, in other words, identifying by what they've chosen to do rather than what they're from the area, not necessarily. So there might be people in other areas which are more conventional, who I feel perhaps won't do quite as well. So I think those people who are doing those things are probably going to do quite a lot of good work. And I mean, and some of those are doing very sophisticated studies. So some of the the work on cognitive ability of dogs, which is going on in Adam Mcleod's group. And it's not just him, it's 4 or 5 people. That group has, I think, a lot of potential to do a lot more. And also the group in Vienna. So the 2 specialist dog groups in Budapest and in Vienna.
But they're both working with MRI now, aren't they, as well?
Yes, they're using MRI, which is one of the ways forward. And another person is Lorenz Gigax, who is in Bern. And he's been doing it for longer than they have. So he's been doing the animals with scanning devices, on brain scanning devices while they're active. The thing I always was very sad about was that I came in too late, really, to be able to use the portable scanning devices, because I tried to find out what was going on in the brain by using things like heart rate variability and things like that, and behavior, of course, which is very useful, but it can't tell you some of the things. So I think that's one of the areas. Sophisticated cognitive studies is one area, and related to that, and often needing to be done in parallel, is direct brain monitoring methodologies. And so some of my colleagues in Cambridge are doing some of these things now. as well. So there are some impressive people doing these sorts of things. And I think they're going to be important in terms of understanding behavior and understanding the many of the aspects of welfare, because how bad are some of the things that we assume are bad? I mean, what things are really bad in life, and also how well can we identify good welfare and pleasure? We need to know more about those things, and I think that in order to do that, we need to have the behavioral people studying behavior, working with those who are looking at physiological measures, especially direct brain function measures. So I think those are going to be exciting things to do. But there are some other sort of big data things. I listened to a paper by Georgia Mason recently, and I mean, okay, so Georgia's been around for quite a while now, but but I mean, she'd actually done an analysis using a very, very large amount of data, and so people are now starting to do things where they're using computers in the way that they ideally can be used, not just to play games, but to analyze very large bodies of information. And so I think that people who are doing the big data studies are also likely to be finding out new things, in particular because we are ultimately studying the brain, and the brain is terribly complicated. And if you use good study methods and big data methods, then you may well find out things which are difficult to find out in other ways. But I think there's still going to be a need for a lot of, I'm quite sure there's still going to be a need for a lot of direct, careful studies, observational studies of behavior to go with it. So you can't just use the automatic recording. You need to have a human who's evaluating some of the behavior as well. So I think behavior observation, ethology is still going to be very important in a lot of these studies.
It's interesting because, yeah, I mean, there's you know, there has been that sort of shift where people, you know, everything went to the molecular level, and trying to find an organismal biologist was quite difficult at one stage, and now it's sort of come back into vogue because, yeah, you can only make sense of these things if you've put them into the that individual as well. So and as you say, with the increasing computing power, we have the ability to model some of those much more complicated things. But anyway, I mustn't keep you any longer. As always, it's been such a pleasure, and thank you so much for not just today, but also for everything that you have done, not just for me, but as I said, well, and not just for humans, how much you've done for animal welfare and science as well. You know, the world's a much better place for you. So thank you so much for everything.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you for all the good work that you've been doing.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. Cheers.